What is civil discourse? It's not agreeing, just like agreeing to get along. It's not being nice for the sake of being nice. It's not pretending to like surrender or surrendering your values because you don't want to, you want to be civil. Civil discourse is about disagreement. It's about disagreeing firmly and strongly while respecting the other person's humanity.
Hi, everyone, and welcome back to another episode of the Tourpreneur Tour Business Podcast. I am your host, as always, Mitch Bach, and today I'm bringing someone not exactly linked to the tour industry into conversation with me, but he is linked to me. For many, many years, I was his tour guide. I was the tour leader taking him as an educator and his group of faithful little 14-year-old eighth graders on trips to New York City and Washington, D.C. Mike Fishback is a friend, but he's also an incredibly deep and knowledgeable thinker and educator, especially in the sort of terrain of what you might call civil discourse. How do we live as storytellers, as tour guests, in these spaces and places of contention? We're in difficult, contentious times. In New York City, just a couple of days ago, there's a huge debate because the federal government ordered the removal of the pride flag from the gay liberation site of the Stonewall Inn in Greenwich Village. That caused a huge uproar. A little bit before that, the city of Philadelphia had to contend with the removal of plaques telling the story of the enslaved history from the original President's House site. This is just the United States, but if I name countries right now, Ukraine, Palestine, Israel, Greenland, these are already probably evoking emotional responses to people all around the world right now. So we're living in a world of contention. And I guess I wanted to dive in with Mike today just on this question of what do we do? What do we do as storytellers that are place-based educators? What do we do when guests are a little bit edgy right now? And also, how do we maintain respect and truth for these sites, these difficult sites where sometimes the truth itself is in debate? And so, Mike Fishback, I don't know if that's enough topics for one conversation, but welcome to Tourpreneur.
Thank you, Mitch. It's always a pleasure to talk with you, and we will try to cover all of those things.
Why don't you start by just giving me a little bit of your own read on what your background is and kind of what you bring to this conversation?
Yeah, sure. I've been teaching for over 2 decades, mostly in the middle grades. So, Mitch, you said little 14-year-olds, but they're
No, they're
pretty
all
big.
taller than me. Yeah.
Yeah. Um, I teach humanities, so that includes social studies. It includes language arts and literature. It includes some theater, journalism, um, and a lot of what I try to do in the classroom, and I'm sure we'll get to this, is develop a sense of curiosity among the kids about just wanting to know more, wanting to understand more about things they don't yet understand. And I think part of the reason I feel some affinity for tour guides, even though I haven't been one, is that in a school classroom, children start out life by being really curious. They want to know everything. They want to put structures together for themselves and understand how things work. And then when they get to school, we quickly, some schools more quickly than others, overlay this system of judgment on them. We evaluate them, we assess them, we tell them when they're wrong, we have them write and judge that, we have them take tests and see if they memorize things. And that, what that serves to do is it kind of takes a lot of the curiosity out of them and instead overlays this sense of defensiveness and sometimes aggressiveness in the face of being questioned or being doubted. And what I love about tour guiding is you as educators aren't dealing, for the most part, aren't dealing with all the judgment structure and are just having people learn for the sake of learning and are able to hopefully reignite that sense of curiosity that was in them all along. And so it's a harder lift in the classroom sometimes when kids are used to that judgment. I mean, I'm still assessing them, I'm still helping them develop skills, but a lot for me is the question of how to do that while centering and front loading the curiosity, the wonder, and the wanting to understand perspectives that are different from theirs in a generous way, assuming that people who they disagree with aren't evil, but assuming they think differently and how to understand their thinking.
That's such a wonderful framing. I think my tour guide school, trip school, gets a lot of former teachers who find
Uh,
it a little bit easier to connect with the beautiful parts of teaching without school boards and curriculums and a lot
I am
of
not
the
surprised.
so I think this world of the people who are out there on the streets or on vehicles, wherever they are, telling these stories, the two worlds are incredibly connected. And yet there's something that troubles me about this kind of dual nature of a guided experience. You have a tour guest who is naturally curious and filled with wonder and awe and excitement about the place where they're visiting, but the place itself isn't only a story that keeps the positive vibes going necessarily. Oftentimes there's darkness in the story,
Mhm.
other times there's contention. And so I guess I wrestle with this question. I wonder if you do as an educator. How much do I, as a guide, honor my paying customer who wants to have a good time? How much do I make sure that I live up to the reality of these difficult places?
Yes, it's a question that humanities educators grapple with in the classroom all the time as well. I do think we want to get away from that binary of there's fun and then there's grappling with difficult things, right? For me, it's more of balancing that than
Mm,
deciding to what extent. Because I think usually when you think about fun in learning, you think like games and competitions and things where people will get their mind off of the learning in order to be fun. And that's
mm,
because in our culture of education, we equate learning with the grind, and then there's fun. I think that deep learning, grappling with difficult topics, is one of the most fun things you can do in the classroom. It's also one of the most difficult and challenging and emotionally taxing. It can be, and we have to be attuned to that. But I think when you aim for meaning, the fun comes with that. Having said that, yes, balancing those two things is a challenge. You mentioned in the introduction about like those difficult learners or tour guests or students. It used to be that I would teach thinking, okay, I'm going to try to get through this lesson, this unit, without it going into contentious politics, contentious issues, and hopefully I'll succeed. But if it does, if someone says something, mentions whoever the president is, or mentions abortion or guns or whatever it is, that I will be able to end that moment as soon as possible with everyone's dignity still intact and everyone wanting to still learn. And that had been my goal. Avoid, but troubleshoot if necessary. I've evolved into a teacher who is much more about building those contentious issues into the learning itself and
mm,
designing lessons where students can both express their views and also listen to and encounter views different than theirs in a way that is respectful and open-minded, not asking anyone to change their minds. And I think this is really important about how to go about this. You don't want anyone to feel like you as a teacher won't be satisfied until they've changed their view about something because they're wrong. What I do aim to do is expand everyone's thinking, regardless of whether they agree with me or not. And I typically don't tell them directly, what my views are, but to have them think like the purpose of this is to encounter as many views as possible, even the difficult to accept ones, and think through them and think like what could have been going through this person's mind who we disagree with, let's say in a case study in history. Why might they have made that choice to do something or not do something? Would I have made that same choice if I were in that position, even though I like to think that in this contemporary moment I would have made a different choice? Those are things that like when kids come streaming out of the classroom after a lesson like that, they keep having the conversations and it's hard for them to transition to like their next subject because they're so into that conversation,
mm.
as opposed to a class where they walk out saying like, okay, I'm glad that's over, I don't have to read that chapter in a textbook anymore. It's a different feel. Like I think the meaningfulness and the grappling is what makes is what can make learning fun and can connect groups of people to one another, which I know is something that really is important in tour guiding because you're around each other all the time and there's a finite amount of time. It's exceptionally important in classrooms where you're with them for a year or a semester and you need to build a classroom culture, and you can't do that just by designing like classroom norms together and putting them up on the wall. It has to be something you're doing related to the subject that gets them thinking together about something important. And so, at least in the classroom context, that's really important to me to make sure that people are building community through structured disagreement where they can explore different ideas that they might not have thought about before.
That's great if you have an entire year to work with a group of people. Is it still applicable to you in your mind? My answer is yes, but is it applicable if you have 3 hours with a group of people?
Of course, yes. Do you want me to talk more about that?
Well, I think we're going to keep talking about it. I think one of the helpful ways we've already reframed this is fun isn't the right word. It's sort of rather about meaning versus infotainment, I would call it. The sense in which that was
That's
a
great
really
distinction.
informative presentation about this place, but it hasn't created some sort of meaning within me. What I'm hearing you saying is that that creation happens through a kind of grappling, a kind of confrontation or engagement with the material. So tell me a little bit more about kind of what that looks like.
You started this conversation with the term civil discourse, which gets a bad rap nowadays. And I want to clarify what at least I mean by that. I think different people mean different things. Some people, and this is a valid critique, people say, well, look around us in the world right now. Things are being dismantled, people are being hurt and killed and separated from their families. What are you talking about, being civil to each other? This is the time to stand up and be aggressive and assertive and clear about what we believe. And anyone who is complicit in this is the enemy and we need to vanquish them. And I totally, totally understand that impulse and it resonates with me. And also, if we're ever going to get out of, and this in the American context, but really globally, if we're going to get out of this era that we're in right now, um, we're not going to do it with just 50% of the population. We have to bring people in to conversation and some kind of reconciliation process.
Hmm.
Um, and so civil discourse would be important. So, what is civil discourse? It's not agreeing to get along. It's not being nice for the sake of being nice. It's not surrendering your values because you want to be civil. Civil discourse is about disagreement. It's about disagreeing firmly and strongly while respecting the other person's humanity. That is harder than it seems, especially in today's environment,
It
and really
doesn't even
always.
seem easy.
It doesn't seem right,
So,
right. To say, this person who I believe is complicit in evil has their own set of fears and anxieties and worries, has their own set of values. Some of them might be my values too, but are trying to enact them in different ways or be true to them in different ways. How can I understand this person as a person like me who sees themselves as the good guy? Everyone, most people see themselves as the good guy, and help them understand what I believe and why I think the way I do, and also so that I can understand more of what's behind what they think. That is civil discourse. It doesn't mean that you end up finding common ground at the end, although you might. I used to do exercises with my students where part of the exercise when you disagree, and by the way, it doesn't have to be what you literally think. It can be, role play this position, right? Where you find some value that you think you have in common. And what often would happen is every side of an issue would see that the value they all share is fairness.
hmm.
Everyone wants to be treated fairly and if people treated fairly. And really, often what a lot of these disagreements are about is that people interpret fairness differently depending on their positionality, what circumstances they're in. What's fair to you doesn't look fair to someone else because of what they experience. And so you can find common ground, but you don't have to necessarily in order to have civil discourse. It just means you're not accusing each other of being Satan, basically. It means that
Yeah.
you're treating them as people who have good intentions, even if those intentions are misguided. And so similarly about, historic sites in this case, or just historical case studies, or literature set in a particular time period where there are
Mm.
people who believe something or act on something that feels completely abominable to modern ears, or in this case, like progressive or liberal ears, that it's important to also try to understand where those people are coming from, why they made the choices they did, not to excuse them, but to understand, both so that you can learn more deeply, but also so that you can better explain and defend your own positions, because now you really understand another side, rather than just having a straw man idea that like a caricature of the other side, especially in our age of polarized media where people
Mm.
don't really understand what other sides are thinking. They think they do because they get the most cartoonish way of thinking about it.
I think there's a real tendency in my decades of taking tours to hear a version of storytelling that sets up an enemy or an other and makes them quite flat as a character in your triumphalist narrative. And it can be quite subtle, and you might kind of be right. I'm thinking of a lot of different scenarios. One of them I want to tease out with you, I don't think it's too extreme, is the bombing of Pearl Harbor in Hawaii. And I've taken that tour many, many
Mhm.
times. It's
Yeah, I've taken that
literally
tour.
a military setting, an American military setting, and Japanese are the enemies. And the Americans are the poor suckers who got surprised and then rose to the occasion and kicked the Japanese butt and saved the world. It's a really easy thing. And I see it all around the world, right? I see the French telling the same stories about Germans or Russians or whatever it might be. How do we get beyond that? And I guess you've made the point about why we should try to get beyond that. But how? Because I imagine that I hear a lot of tour guides saying it's a little easier to rest in the talk that I know works and
Yeah.
is safe and is accurate. Why would I open this Pandora's
Yeah.
box?
There's a book called History Lessons that I've used when I teach US history,
Hmm.
that goes through significant events in US history from the perspectives of different countries' textbooks. So in this example, I used it to teach the Spanish-American War, which is kind of a blip in a US history textbook. There's like a chapter, it's usually focused on Theodore Roosevelt. And reading the textbook from Spain, the textbook from Cuba, the textbook from the Philippines, which actually views it as two wars. The second is the Philippine-American War, where the US basically colonizes the Philippines, which in the US textbook is like two sentences about restoring order to the Philippines, right? And my point in saying this is that it's not about giving the accurate version, because there are many accurate versions. A lot of teachers, at least in their rhetoric, and schools in their rhetoric, will profess to be free of bias. They're not gonna have bias in what they do. They're going to be objective. And really, I push back against that and say, like, everything we do and say and write is biased. It's in the words we choose to describe something, whether something's an uprising or a riot. It's in the narratives we choose to provide, and the narratives we either choose to ignore, or that we don't know about and we end up ignoring them. So what is the best way to do that is actually look at the narratives of different sides of the disagreement or war or battle or whatever it is, and what are their stories. I do this, by the way, with Israel and Palestine. That, let's read an Israeli narrative of 1948 and let's read a Palestinian narrative of 1948. What are the things that are similar about them? And in fact, there's not too many things similar about them, just like dates and there was a war. What are the details you learn from these narratives that you wouldn't have learned if you only read one? And sometimes you might say, well, I can't trust these details because this is the side I don't like. And okay, sure. So take it with a grain of salt. But this is the narrative that they tell themselves, and that narrative is the thing that propels people now into doing what they do, right? So like a narrative of Pearl Harbor, like the Japanese perspective on Pearl Harbor, I think it's like, nationalist propaganda. That was important. It's important to understand because it led to um atrocities of World War II, and it led to the US's response and the US's own atrocities, and it led to the current world we live in. And so you want to understand those narratives. And of course, you can debate like whether, like to the extent of which they were legitimate narratives for that population to have. So I think it's the same at a level of countries as it is on the level of people. Like understand where they're coming from and why they make the decisions they do. Analyze the narratives, synthesize them, figure out like how do I make sense of these two or more narratives together? What do I understand about this that I might not have understood with just one?
Isn't there a risk in that of platforming points of view that don't deserve visibility? If we switch examples, for example, I'm a gay man. I lived in Greenwich Village, the Stonewall Inn as a site of an uprising of gay liberation, of the visibility of me, of my people, of a lot of marginalized people in the world, finally feeling like they are able to march with pride and with safety through the streets of New York City and reverberating around the world and say, I am here, I exist as a human being. Why am I going to sit there and give lip service to the police that beat them and arrested them and said, take off your clothes and prove that you're a man?
Yeah, this is tough. And I'll say this is a good opportunity to also point out that as if you are going to center contentious issues, then as the teacher or as the tour guide, you get to decide what the contentious issue is that you're framing.
Hmm.
In the example of Stonewall, you wouldn't frame the contentious issue as do gay and trans people exist or not? What are the signs, right? That's not a helpful debate to center, although it is a debate that is out there in the world.
Yeah.
I also would say in the case of Stonewall, like I wouldn't make it about what were the good things about the police. I mean, I think we just talked about Pearl Harbor, so I don't know how far I'd go with this, but I'd say like if it's someone if it's a side that is violently harassing and attacking other people,
Okay.
or actually no, this is the distinction with Pearl Harbor. If it's a side that's violently harassing and attacking other people who haven't already been violent, who are peaceful people who are just minding their own business, right? Then you don't want to be in a position where you're like, well, what could have been good about going into gay bars and roughing up the that probably wouldn't be
Yeah.
what
Yeah.
the contentious issue you might focus on with something like Stonewall is within the queer population. What were the choices people made given the circumstances of what it meant to be open and gay at the time? Most gay people wouldn't go to a place like Stonewall because they were completely in the closet. They made a choice that it was better to not tell anyone about who they were and what their identity was, or even to hide it from themselves because of the societal circumstances. A lot of people at Stonewall were people who were living double lives and who had presumably heterosexual lives and families, and then were also gay and would go to a place that was safe to be gay for an evening. And then there were people who were out and proud and lived openly and with risks. And thinking about what are the choices people make about how much to risk if you were caught, knowing what the consequences would be. And those questions are still questions people ask themselves, especially in an era now, at least in the US, where the government is now encouraging people to essentially go back in the closet. The other contention is about uprising. So the reason Stonewall is such a significant historical event is that all the other times that gay bars were raided, most of the times gay bars were raided, the people just accepted that, okay, I got caught, I'm going to be arrested, my life's going to be ruined. And at Stonewall, people decided, no, we're not going to take this. We're going to fight back against the police. And honestly, in an era now where many Americans are, again, making decisions about if and whether and how to stand up against law enforcement injustice, it's a really interesting question to ask about, what were the choices people had? Why did people choose to accept their fate? Why did people choose to fight back? If you were in that situation, knowing yourself, knowing your temperament, knowing your level of risk aversion, knowing your sense of yourself and your identity, what would you have done? A lot of people like to think they would have been active at Stonewall in fighting back. And honestly, I think a lot of people who think that would not have been. And so my point is, you as a teacher get to then select choose in advance what is the contentious issue we're going to be grappling with. And it gives room for a lot of different people with a lot of different political viewpoints to opine on these choices. But those framings take as a given that queer people exist, that they are that there are really difficult choices in 1969 that you see echoes of now, and that these are you can imagine everyone's humanity in these choices. The people who make decisions that you think are awful, like if you are someone who can imagine living your life in the closet, and you are now thinking about someone who lives their life in the closet and why, and how, is that a legitimate choice to make in that time period? Is it a legitimate choice to make now? I mean, those are things that are worth grappling with, at least in a classroom, and I can imagine on a tour, um, something that allows everyone's humanity to be at the forefront, and also being able to imagine the difficult choices of lots of different kinds of people.
I'm obsessed with this word grappling because if you frame yourself as a guide, not as a authoritative storyteller, but as a grappler with stories, that's a different type of research. That's a different type of, I guess, quote unquote presentation. Like, what am I doing with this group of curious, awestruck, open, kind, excited travelers in this space? That's a really cool responsibility as a guide, not to just say, make sure I get my facts right and then say them in a dynamic way with arms flapping so they stay attuned. But what question can I ask my audience that gets responses that allows me to tease a deeper truth or grapple with something that's worth, to your point, grappling with here?
Yeah, and it may seem scary to
Yeah,
do it that way. I mean, I love a great hands flapping story, and I do it constantly too.
sure. Sure. This isn't also to say every single moment a guide is opening their
Of course
mouth.
not. Yeah, yeah.
Yes.
What I do think is when it is a topic or a location that has the potential to be contentious. What I'm suggesting is better to lead with the contention and have the moment be about grappling with it than to give one narrative that reflects only one side of it, and have someone in that group, have someone in that class or tour group say, no, you're wrong about that narrative. And then it
Mm-hmm.
becomes you versus your learner.
Mm-hmm.
And even if you're right, and I'm sure you're right and they're wrong, you still now have that battle between you and the learners, where either you can win it, you can surrender, you can bring that person aside and talk to them. Better instead to frame it as, this is a hard thing to think about, and there are disagreements about what the right decisions were here. Let's think about that together. And that way people are invited to express their thinking, not as a pushback to you, but as part of the conversation that you've facilitated. And so I think while it might seem scary to frame it that way, it actually is easier in the long run. And it also allows a group of learners to bond together in ways that just sitting there listening to a fun story doesn't necessarily do.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. I think it ends up being a richer experience. There is one aspect to this that I think is important to bring up in this sort of like new idea of kind of story grappling that we're talking about. And I think it means before you begin, there is a certain personal excavation of understanding your own biases and your perspective of like, what am I bringing to this grappling as a very particular person?
Yes. It's work that you need to do as an educator in advance, and it's work that you need to do with the group before you start not to overuse the word, before you start the grappling, right? With specific things. There are ways to do that. I mean, in classrooms, and I mentioned this earlier, there's a setting of classroom norms and expectations, which a lot of teachers now do. It's considered best practice, where before you start learning anything, you kind of say, okay, how do we want to treat each other when things get difficult? I think, so that can be part of it, including with a group that you're only seeing for a little bit. Sharing stories of who you are, where you're coming from, sharing stories about when you have been in situations where you feel you haven't been listened to, sharing stories about when you've had an opinion about something that was not the predominant opinion in the space, and what decisions you made, what you've done, when you felt safe, when you haven't felt safe, when you felt brave to speak up, when you haven't. All of those, I wouldn't do all of those, but like an assortment of those. All of those prompts, what they help to do is they help to humanize everyone in the space. That we're all on this journey of figuring out who we are and figuring out what we believe, figuring out what our values are. And as we continue with our learning together, we want to make sure we're respecting and honoring and celebrating each of our journeys, because we're all on versions of that journey. And what that does is it sets an expectation that we're not going to be know-it-alls here, including the teacher. We're going to be open-minded and curious. And when you do encounter a situation where someone or a group of people are getting difficult in their pushback or in their knowledge, so like there'll be a learner who just knows so much and wants to tell you everything they know, and it kind of derails the rhythm of
Mhm.
your lesson. Once you've set those expectations, now you can take that person aside and say, not to say, hey, remember these expectations, but to say, hey, in the spirit of this expectation we set, the next thing we're going to do, I'd like to have it, this in such a way. Could you help me figure out how to do that effectively? Um, I would like a lot of other people in our group to be able to also share what they know or what they believe as much as you're doing. Do you have some ideas of how we can set that up? Like, help me do that together. And you can enlist them in that process because you've already set those expectations. It's not a surprise. It's not seen as a reprimand as much as it's seen as a um, I need your help in doing this. This is not it's not gonna work every time, but it makes it much more likely that you can deal with potential problematic learners without it derailing the learning for that person and for everyone else in the group.
It's a fine line because you are, as this disproportionately knowledgeable presence within this group of learners, you're the authority. So but it's what I hear you saying is maybe that yes, you're an authority, but it's not meant in a one directional way that you just shove that authority and that knowledge down the throats of these people who have to passively accept it.
Yeah, when you say it that way, definitely not. I think there are two roles to be front and center. One, yes, you know enough about the topic, the subject matter, that you know what to bring learners to, what to wonder about. You know what to go to next and how to respond to what people are asking. And the other role is that you have developed a structure for discussion or for exploration, that people know that they have a routine enough that they can feel comfortable being part of that routine. So those are really the two roles. Neither of them require you knowing everything. And in fact, knowing everything and being happy and proud of knowing everything can actually be a weakness if you're not careful.
Mm. So, what are some of these strategies you use in the classroom that we can take out into our guiding environments to begin that facilitation process? Do you begin with open-ended questions? Do you frame things in a certain way?
Yeah, there's a lot of different strategies. I think that one that I want to point out actually, because it's I think particularly relevant to bringing people to a location they haven't been to before. It's a really simple technique. It's asking, what do you notice here?
Mm.
Bringing them to something that is, I mean, in the classroom, it can be a text, it can be artifact of some sort, an image, a natural phenomenon. What are all the things you see? And just let people name them. It can be big things, it can be details. Saying, don't ask questions about it yet. Don't try to interpret what it's supposed to be. Just what do you see? The first thing that does is it grants equal access to everyone. Even if they know a lot about it, as we've been talking about, they're only naming one thing and everyone else is too. And then you can do another round and name more things. So everyone kind of comes into it as long as they have eyes. Not everyone will be able to see, but like you can find other ways for people to notice things. They can can contribute. Once people have noticed, the next step is, what are you wondering about? Now that you have all these things that you've noticed, what questions arise for you? It could be a discrepancy between two of the things that you're seeing. It could be about the purpose of why this is here, what this thing was used for, why this thing was erected, whatever it might be. And then as they ask questions, often learners will naturally start to develop theories of what's going on. I think this was there. And often those theories are competing with each other or contrasting. And so the facilitation work here is about putting these questions and theories in conversation with each other, letting one learner's theory reveal something that's missing in another learner's theory, and they can work together to figure out what might be going on. It also the other purpose of that kind of exercise is it hooks everyone in to really be curious, because now once they've done the work of trying to figure something out, they really want to know. So at some point you can then give them information, something you know. It
Mhm.
doesn't have to be the whole thing. It can be like, by the way, would you like me to tell you when this was made? Like, and just a little tease, and they'll all be like, yeah, yeah, please. And so I'll give them a date. And they'd be like, oh, and then it calls them into questioning a lot of their theories. And now they have to rethink things. And just that process is, by the way, this can go on for like a whole class period, a whole week,
Yeah.
just exploring.
Yeah.
And then the next part of that is, okay, now that they've explored this and are having all these questions, what's the next thing to bring them to? What's the next room in this house, historic home? What's the next painting in this art gallery? What's the next thing that will get them to think even deeper and that might spark cognitive dissonance, meaning they thought they had it all figured out, but now they have this new thing and they're realizing, oh, wait, that conflicts with what I thought. And when they're doing it together, this is also, as I said before about other things, a bonding experience. They're all wondering together. And that sense of curiosity, it can be both about just regular run of the mill mundane things, and it can be about other people's perspectives. Like it's all curiosity is curiosity. What this does too is it shows people what it looks like, what it feels like to have their mind open about something, where they're really able to absorb different ideas and make sense of them together. And then when it gets to the tricky stuff, to the disagreements, groups are more likely to be able to do that.
Mm. I really like that strategy of anchoring it in your visual field because it's more or less undebatable. There might be some things to debate what you see, but you're not saying, what does everyone think about gay rights?
Oh yeah,
That's another open ended question that would get
yeah.
people.
Now I will say though, yes, you're right. Another starter could be something where you as the teacher have figured out a connection to their own lives. So like something like, when think about a time when you were angry at someone in your family, what happened? And turn and talk to someone next. And it could be like that kind of personal level. And then as you then teach the history, the learners start to realize, oh, I know why they did it from, because that's like this situation, and it could be a connection thing. The difference between that and the noticings and wonderings is, in this case, the teacher is deciding what the frame is going to be. This is going to be about people being angry at each other.
Mm,
Whereas the noticings and wonderings, it puts that decision about what the framing is going to be into the group's hands. One group may notice a group set of things that another group doesn't notice at all, and it might be end up being a different theme, even though it's the same artifact, the same place, the same text. Which is exciting for a teacher because it means you're not going to just be doing the same thing with group after group after group. It's that each group and each learner has their own agency and their own brain and their own set of experiences that are going to inform what they say.
I think there's a couple of takeaways here for the kind of tour guide, which is first of all, you're probably going to end up saying all the knowledge and things that you said anyway. It's just a little bit more dynamic to hang it off of people's visual noticings than off of your perfectly kind of scripted iteration of,
Definitely.
what this is. I think of this in terms of visually rich or incredibly detailed places. In Washington, D.C., Arlington National Cemetery. I always start with what do you notice because somebody goes, I see the crosses, I see the names, I see the Medal of Honor. I see the perfectly manicured grass. I see the marble. I see that house up on the hill. And suddenly, before you
There it is.
know it, there it
Yeah.
is. That could have been my talk, but everyone feels like they co created that. the experience together. So
Yes.
that's one bucket, but the other one I think is actually really, really powerful, which is I'm secretly creating a theme here to what we're doing by that question, anchoring it in your lived experience. And when you were talking about the Stonewall Uprising, about this idea of which side would you be on, implicit in that is a question of power, of also words and who gets to describe an event authoritatively. And to me, part of this grappling is also a grappling on a fundamental level as a guide, as a researcher, as a tour business with like, what am I trying to get at? Because there could be 18 different entrances or ways to frame this. So is
Yeah.
that a valid thing to think of in advance
Wow.
too?
I love how you phrase that question. Is it a valid thing to This is something I really struggle with, or sorry, grapple with a lot. This is a word we're overusing so much that people are going to be tired of. So when I used to teach pre-service teachers at the university level, the foundational text I used was called Understanding by Design, and this is by two educational researchers, theorists, who their idea is as a unit planner, you want to start with what do we want them to understand in the end. How are we, and then work backward. How are we going to assess that understanding? What activities are we going to do so students demonstrate that understanding? What texts and lessons are we gonna put out there so that they can start thinking about it, etc. And then finally, what is the hook? And there's something to be said for that. There's wisdom in that, in that there are a lot of things that students may be thinking about that don't really matter, that don't have meaning. To get back to one thing we were talking about at the very beginning, like making it meaningful, that designing for understanding helps make sure that there is meaning in
Hmm.
what they do. On the other hand, if you start with noticings and wonderings and trust the group to figure out together where this is going, where their exploration's going, what questions they have, and then follow the lead of the group, you will get somewhere meaningful as well. It'll be meaningful for those learners because they're the ones, not just they feel like they've co-constructed it, but they actually have co-constructed it with each other and with you. I actually feel like in a tour, it's a lot easier to do it that second way than in a classroom. Because in a classroom, you have to get through all sorts of things in the unit or the time you have in the class. There's often different sections of a class if it's a larger school. And so you want to make sure they're consistent and they're kind of on schedule. With a tour group where it's that you in that one group and you have flexibility of ideally of where you might take them and how long you might stay places. Although now that I'm thinking about it, maybe you don't have that flexibility. Things are pretty tight on those schedules. But that you can really work with that group to decide what's meaningful for them. I think there's validity in both of those approaches. And yeah, I mean the first one, the understanding by design way, it does center the teacher's background knowledge a little bit more so that the teacher decides what's going to be the end point. And it will work for that group of learners. It'll be great. And there's a sense of a thrill to the first type where people are really discovering together. It can be more fun for the learners, it can be more fun for the teacher, and it can also teach you about what might be meaningful that you might not have thought of before. uh, you can get the pulse of, especially if it's a population of learners that you keep working with over and over, but different people. You can see like what do people like this tend to think about, and then you can then do a understanding by design approach that actually taps into that. But you've only learned about it because you allowed a group to explore.
Do you have scenarios kind of in your classroom setting where the noticing strategy doesn't immediately yield the kind of material that you need to sort of go on this learning adventure with people?
That's a great question. I wouldn't say yes to your question, but I would say you can't just teach that way. Like it's part of the
Yeah,
toolbox, right? Or
sure.
I'll say
Yeah.
you can teach that way, but yeah, these are all tools, and so just getting back to fun versus meaning. I mean, there are some,
Mm,
especially if something's really serious and deep and challenging to think through, you do want to get to the food often, right? Where it's just eating and it's just enjoying. You do want to play games. I mean, in my 8th grade's US civics class, this organization called iCivics has all these computer games. We were role playing presidents and legislators and Supreme Court justices. And yeah, I mean, do that, make it fun where you're not doing the grappling. Because that also is a bonding experience. And then so what you want to do is like, just as any lesson or any stop on a tour has a rhythm to it, you also want to figure out what the rhythm is to which tools you're using. For many years, I started the whole school year with a noticings, wonderings exercise, which was great in many respects. But I also noticed that, especially in larger classes where that means not everyone is going to be contributing, all that they're contributing maybe like twice in the class period, that it can get dull if everyone's saying the same thing over and over. They're noticing the same thing. So I realized, okay, maybe I don't want to start with that. Maybe I want to start with something more dynamic, and then second week or like before we do our first main unit, like start with that, where they've already established that they're a part of this classroom. That I think for each individual educator, there's a different way of balancing and ordering and structuring. You might want to start with the fun first and then go to the more serious. You might want to just do the fun and then later on, while you're somewhere else, by the way, that meal we had, and incorporate that in. I'm not an expert in this, but I'll say like just the pacing and what happens in which moment of learning is important. And it's something that each teacher figures out as they go, what their rhythm looks like and what their rapport with the group looks like so that they can plan that rhythm well.
That word toolkit, I think, is so important, that this is a reframing of the idea of a guide as a single set of skills, which is dynamically delivering knowledge to a group of people, versus different strategies that unlock different kinds of conversations at the right moment. You pull out the
Yeah.
tool for the right group at the right moment at the right topic. I like that.
I'll say something else too about it, because when you are a story when all you are is a storyteller, and the rhythm is in your presentation, and that means if someone is talking during it or if someone is saying something during it, it's throwing off your rhythm.
Mm.
And then again, it becomes you versus the learner or the supposed learner. Whereas if you're structuring much of what you do as something where everyone's participating in a meaningful way, not like an answering trivia questions, like who knows the answer to this? And then one person is wrong and you're like, no, wrong. And the other person, no, wrong. And then the next person's right. Oh, good, you got it right. That's superficial interactive, and that actually sets up people feeling stupid. But if it's real interaction with you and with each other, where they're thinking through a question that's challenging, that's difficult, then there aren't really interruptions. There's just participation. And then when it comes time, that moment where you're going to be the narrative storyteller, where all eyes are on you in that moment, you're much more likely to get the buy-in,
Mm.
because people don't feel like, oh, another story, I'm going to go wander. It's like, oh, wow, a story now. Because as you said, you're using this toolkit, and so the really entertaining story, it's something where everyone's going to be listening and rapt, because you're not doing it all the time. It's like, this is the moment where you're doing it.
Yeah. How do you make sure everybody feels included in this experience? Here's what I'm getting at. I know this because I've gone, for example, to conferences where I just feel like totally like an outsider and my whole social self just kind of shuts down. I know there's reasons that could be related to language skills, race, all sorts of reasons why you feel like this is a conversation the tour group is having, but
Mm,
I'm not going to
yeah,
speak up.
yeah, yeah.
You might be, let me make it really clear. I had an example where it was 11 Democrats and one Republican,
Hmm.
and examples of the one black person
Yeah,
and 11 very vocal white people talking about this site or whatever. Very, very different perspectives and a lot of reason to just zip your mouth shut because it might be a hornet's nest or you might
yeah,
feel
yeah. I
criticized.
had a colleague once who taught history alongside me. She was a white woman, older white woman, had read a lot about race in the classroom, and using all her knowledge, which she told me she was very proud of, like whenever there was, and we were in a predominantly white school, and every year when there was the one black student in her class, she was so proud. She would go to that black student. The first interaction would be, I want you to know you shouldn't have to speak for all black people in this class. And she was so proud of herself for having told this student that. And I would always cringe, like, oh, okay, so what you're communicating is the first thing you're noticing about that person is that they might feel like um and so I think the way in to your question is give plenty of opportunities constantly throughout for the learners to share about themselves in a structured way where everyone's going to have equal access to everyone's voice and equal opportunity to share. And there are lots of ways to do it, no matter what the subject matter is. You can always find connections to people's experience. And it can be things that deeply relevant to difficult subject matter, but can also be just getting to know you stuff. And it's not just at the beginning either. I think this is important because at the beginning, especially for people who might feel on the outskirts, on the outside, the beginning is the time where they're kind of taking the lay of the land and figuring out how safe things are. They're not necessarily going to feel ready to share of themselves at the beginning and be known at the beginning. But if you sprinkle it throughout, if that's part of your toolkit, then hopefully, if your rhythm is right, you, and the content is meaningful enough, that over time, those people will feel like they can be known, and then other people can can make those people feel like they're known. The importance of that when I talk about being known is that, okay, so I teach middle school kids usually, and every single one of them feels like they're not measuring up to everyone else. They all feel like they're on the outside, and they all feel like they're the only one who feels that way. and and by having that sharing, consistent sharing, opportunities to do that. Often in middle schools, it's done through advisory, where it's not even academic class. It's like you come together as a group that's like learning about life skills or social and emotional things. You start to realize, okay, I feel marginalized and this person does too. And I thought this person had it all together and they don't. And you sort of, and it helps you not just feel more comfortable in the group, but it helps you realize that everyone has this level of discomfort. But if you're all feeling uncomfortable together, then that makes you comfortable. In terms of your specific example about someone who's like the one Republican in a group of Democrats, right? That's another example where if they do make it known, even if it's just to you, it's another opportunity to bring them aside and say, hey, I really want everyone to be able to learn what these different perspectives are, including yours. Can we think about like the next thing we're doing, the next lesson, the next place we're going? Let's set up a moment where that can happen. Can you work with me on it? Because I want people to understand where you're coming from. Then they may say no, that's not their thing, but to have an invitation to them. I often invite kids who seem to be the kids who are like a little bit quirkier than other people, or not really like in the center of the group, who have something to share, who have something, who have a really distinct, unique skill or talent or interest, to come up and like teach the class for 20 minutes one day, and be the person who's the authority, so that people see them as someone who they can look up to rather than down on. And it's amazing what that does,
Wow.
like people's sense of themselves. People have come to me years later to say like, that remember when I taught your class like that? It's really meaningful, and especially in a time when you have a small group where that group is getting to know each other, to allow for different people to be the authority at different moments, and to do it strategically, to do it with them in advance, so you're not putting them on the spot, but to give that invitation and hopefully having them accept the invitation can be life transforming for people.
And on a less transformative level, a little bit of a group release valve. I call this kind of character the history dad, the guy that like yes ands you at the end of every story you tell. They're like, oh, also, also,
Yeah,
also,
yeah, yeah,
also. And I've learned over the years, I give them a little stage. I give them a little 2 minutes
yeah.
and let them take the stage and tell the story of X, Y, or Z. And it's usually good. And then I don't know, it just like calms them. They don't feel like they have to like butt in every single time
Yeah,
at every time.
often the people who do that, both adult and kid, are the people who they know so much and they want to make sure people know they know. And the
Yeah.
reason they keep doing it over and over is that the reactions, both from teacher and the rest of the group, tend to be eye rolls. You're right. If you do it just once, where it's not an eye roll, where it's a, I want you to tell us now, please, and better off talking to them in advance and like designing that moment so that it's what they want, it often means that they then now feel like they don't have to prove themselves anymore, and they can be much more within the rhythm that you're trying to create of that group.
And it's also just seeing your tour group as an ally in the
Yeah.
co-creation of this experience and not as the, I won't say enemy, but an audience that
Yeah.
doesn't have legitimate value because there's a little bit of this stereotype or idea that I'm the guide, you're here, you paid for me. You didn't pay for this other guy. You didn't pay for a little conversation. You paid for me. You want to know about me. But I don't know if that stereotype or that belief does full justice to the possibility of what a great group dynamic could be.
You paid for an experience that you are having where the tour guide is the person who's facilitating the experience. And I think if you think of it that way, just like in a classroom, I mean, whether maybe they're not paying for it, maybe they are, what you're buying into when your child comes into a classroom is you want them to have a learning experience. And hopefully the teacher is good and you trust the teacher, but you're not hoping the teacher is performing for an audience necessarily. Sometimes, sometimes, but that's not the primary thing we do. It's one of many things we can do. And think of the teacher less as the actor on stage and more of the director. They're facilitating, they're figuring out, they're designing a learning experience. And that learning experience can look a lot of different ways. And ideally, every learning experience of that sequence looks a little bit different. If you do the same thing over and over again, whether it's just a narrative storytelling, whether it's noticings, wonderings, whether it's connect to your own person, if you're doing the same thing over and over, it's going to then feel okay, this again. Even if it's really good, even if you're really good at it, at some point there's going to be burnout. If there's variety and it's interactive, if a lot of it's interactive and there's downtime and there's fun time and there's all those things, same is true in a classroom as on a tour. You want it to be variety, but you also want it to be meaningful. And so a lot of what I'm saying is don't forget to include and center the meaning making, the curiosity, the wondering, the learning different perspectives, the grappling with difficult issues. Don't sacrifice that for just being fun and entertaining. It's not going to be as meaningful ultimately and as memorable. And it's also going to set you up as an educator, and for lack of a better term, as an educator who, if someone doesn't like what you're saying, can then challenge you. And that's why that grappling and meaning making is so important.
That is a great closing sentiment, and I wish I could end there. And we are at the hour mark, but I have two really quick rapid fire questions. One is you've always been really good as a sort of partner in crime as I've guided your groups. I often say the wrong thing, I screw up all the time. I'm wondering what your advice you like the wrong thing comes out of my mouth. What what strategies or how do you think of those moments where like you as like the educator put your foot in your mouth or said
Mhm.
something inappropriate?
That's a great question. Well, there are two categories of that. One is where you immediately realize you've done it, and the other is where you realize it much later or someone brings it to your attention.
Mm.
And I think on both of those occasions, it's always better to acknowledge and to say, "Oh, I shouldn't have." And actually, as someone who teaches adolescents, and part of what we're teaching them beyond academics and beyond content is how to be um, a successful person in the world. um, a lot of it is modeling what you do when you mess up,
Mm.
not just telling people what they should do when they mess up, but messing up yourself and fessing up to it and saying like, "Here's what I learned from it. Here's how I'm going to get better." Um, I often try to mess up in a minor way in the first week of every school year so that I can apologize to my class for a lesson that wasn't as good as I wanted it to be. And and I'll ask, how can I do better next time? And it takes a lot of confidence to do that.
Yeah, that's
But what it does, if you're willing, if you think to do that, I wouldn't necessarily do it on the first like hour of a tour, but what it does is it establishes this is a space where people can mess up safely and where we don't have to have so much pride that we can't um, like all get better together. So if you catch yourself, and it's just like a word phrase, just, it's great just to stop and say, you know what, I realized I said that. I should have said, if it's something where you've inadvertently, you think you might have offended or insulted a person, that might be something where you take them aside as soon as you can and say, "Hey, that moment, did I just make you feel like awful?" And if you are, don't wait for them to tell you if you realize it, because then the fact that you noticed it is everything. It's everything to that person. And they're going to be totally like, "Oh, wow, thank you for." It'll be a bonding moment even though you insulted them. If it's something that you realize like a day later, in my case, sometimes a month later, or if someone brings it to your attention. This is getting back to the civil discourse. It's important not to be so defensive that you can't be fully human in that moment. So, in the early days of teaching, when I was a young teacher and I had a lot to prove, and someone would come to me like that, I would like tell them all the ways it wasn't really that bad, which I realize now is like the worst thing you can do. Uh,
Hmm.
but I think again, it's like you were in a position of modeling for everyone else what you'd like them to do if they're in that situation. And so, yeah, thank you for letting me know. Tell me more about that. What else do I need to know that maybe like, because often if someone has the courage to come to an authority figure and tell them that something they said or did was like hurtful or had a blind spot in some way, it takes a lot of courage, and often they're just skimming the surface. Like they're saying one thing and there's others,
Yeah.
um, and then to be able to have a conversation with the group, say like, "Thank you so much, this person, for calling this to my attention. Here's what I am going to try to do differently. Please help me." I think that shows a lot of humanity and vulnerability in the best sense of that idea.
What about the converse where the tour guest says something pretty bad or pretty
Yeah.
wrong?
Yeah. The go-to response for me is, "Tell us more about that." Usually, someone, again, this is all about assuming the best in everyone until you really can't anymore, rather than assuming the worst and then realizing there was something where they just needed to learn, right?
Yeah.
So in most cases, not at all, sometimes it's something where it's so urgent that like you really have to shut something down, but you want to try to avoid the shutdown as much as you can, because once you shut down what someone said, you're shutting them down as a learner. Like their mind is going to be all about that moment where they were embarrassed and humiliated by the person in authority. They're not going to learn any more stuff that day from you, or maybe from anyone. And it also makes it more toxic for the group, even if what you've done is on the behalf of the other learners. You've shut it down for their sake, but then you also created this tension, or you've exacerbated. I mean, maybe the person created the tension, but you've exacerbated the tension in a way that becomes something where your teaching and your guiding is going to be less effective now. When you say, "Tell me more," and you give them an opportunity to, not, maybe they had a jab at something or said something in a way like that, when you give them the floor to like explain themselves, in most cases, in my experience, in most cases, it's something they're working through. They didn't say it very artfully. They have an opinion that maybe is like everyone else disagrees with, but maybe they can show where they're coming from and everyone can help them. Usually, if someone is going to try to sabotage something and they're deliberately being provocative and difficult, the "tell me more" is an invitation to say it in a more circumspect way. So usually the most vile thing that comes out of their mouth will be that first thing,
Hmm.
and the "tell me more" is a de-escalation. The other way to do it, either in conjunction with a "tell me more" publicly or instead of it, is to bring that person aside and talk to them, like, and ask them, "Tell me more about this," so it's not public. What you don't want to do is kind of like be the defender of everyone else in that public moment, so that this person is the evil one and you're the good guy, because your job is to facilitate a learning experience, an exploratory experience, and that works against that goal. You do want to make sure everyone's psychologically safe. I mean, this is why it's a struggle to figure out what to do. Because if someone's offended you or insulted someone in the group, then you want to make sure that everyone understands that's not appropriate, and that it's not going to be accommodated. But you can do it in a way that's less punitive and more centering your curiosity. Which again, that's the theme of what I've been saying the whole conversation, which is if you lead with curiosity, you're likely to get to a place that you want to get to, even especially in the toughest moments.
Well, I sincerely appreciate you coming to this conversation, grappling with me for this hour. You've taught me a lot over the years of how to be a more sensitive guide myself. And I think the themes here are, I don't know, hopefully an invitation to see the richness of a shared group experience that can come from these types of strategies. And so my hope is that our listeners are open to taking something away from this and trying it. Is that your hope for this conversation too? Or
Yeah, I hope people will experiment, see what they're comfortable with. I mean, there's no one size fits all for any educator. I think a lot of teacher training programs assume that there is, that this is the way to do it, this is the best way to do it. What you really want to make sure you do with any teaching role, and tour guides are definitely a teaching role, is that you're thinking about what experience you want them to have. Not necessarily what understanding you want them to have, but what experience you want them to have. How do you want them to feel? What do you want them to take away from it? What do you want them to learn about themselves? That really, even as you're teaching a subject, content, ultimately they're learning about themselves, how they think, how they react, how their experiences connect to the world. And if whatever items in the toolkit help you to do that, I hope that people listening will try them out, fail, and then apologize for the failure. And then use some other things, try it again. Anything to make the experience of learning more human, more humane, and more open to wonder and curiosity.
well, Mike, I really appreciate you stepping off the tour bus and stepping into the podcast studio with me today. Thank you.
It's a pleasure. Thank you, Mitch.